Hi, this is Dr. Mike Chupp, and you're listening to CMDA Matters, the weekly podcast of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. Today's conversation with Dr. Christina Francis, an OBGYN from Fort Wayne, Indiana, took place earlier this month, and we felt compelled to bring it to you today without delay because we're going to be talking about the upcoming oral arguments for the landmark abortion case from the great state of Mississippi before our nation's highest court. That case is called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's and is going before the U.S. Supreme Court on December 1st. Today's interview is a little longer than normal, but I hope that you will take the time to listen carefully. We will talk about how this Supreme Court case has the potential to bring down the woeful 1973 Roe v. Wade decision that has divided our nation for nearly 50 years. Let's jump right into an interview that I pray you will not soon forget. Well, today, before I introduce our guest on CMDA Matters, I want to welcome my co-host, who you will see is extreme. He's always appropriate to join me for our interviews, but today especially so because our topic is going to focus on the upcoming Supreme Court case with opening arguments on December 1st, the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health case. Our guest has informed us that we have many white coats that are going to show up on that day. So welcome to my co-host today, Dr. Jeff Barrows, our Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Bioethics.
Well, Mike, as a pro-life OBGYN, I am very honored to be here with you on this interview with Dr. Francis and very much looking forward to it. I think it will be very informative to all our members.
Well, our guest today is Dr. Christina Francis. She's a board-certified OBGYN who's currently working in the great state of Indiana, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, as an OBGYN hospitalist. She's also chair of the board of the American Association of Pro-Life OBGYNs, better known as APLOG or APLOG, and a board member of the Indiana Right to Life. She's been a pro-life speaker for many years and offers her medical expertise as well as knowledge of bioethics and pro-life reasoning, both here in the U.S. as well as around the globe. She's been very passionate about human rights and has spent a lot of the last 10 years in various countries working tirelessly on behalf of women and children. She's spent time working with orphans in Romania and Burma, discussing the importance of life issues with university students in Israel. And also, something very endearing to me is she worked for 3 years as the only OBGYN at a mission hospital in rural Kenya. I think that was Kapsawar Hospital, wasn't it, Dr. Francis?
It was.
And you left Kenya in 2014 to work on behalf of women and children in your own home state and beyond who are victims of the abortion industry, as well as to educate people on the greatest social injustice of our time, abortion. Welcome to CMDA Matters today, Dr. Francis.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Well, tell our listeners, why were you serving in Kenya as a medical missionary and OBGYN and then decide to come back to the States to take on a new challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know it is funny, Mike, how much we have in common actually in that. So, having spent many years in Kenya, how that captures your heart. And I went into medical school planning to do medical missions full time. And that was really what got me through medical school, was just that vision of what the Lord had for me to do after I finished my medical training. And then as I was nearing the end of my residency, I found out about the post-residency program with Samaritan's Purse and applied and was accepted and started looking at where I was going to go. I didn't really have a good idea other than I knew that I wanted to be in Africa. And so after a lot of prayer and discussion with Samaritan's Purse, settled on Kapsawar Mission Hospital, which is in a very rural part of Kenya. It's a small town where it's at, but serves a great need as really the only fully functional hospital in that area. And so went there straight out of residency and fell in love with the people there and just really was it felt like home, and knew that that was what the Lord had for me to do. And so I did my 2-year stint with the post-residency program in Capsoir, and then came back to the States for a planned time in the States to switch to a long-term sending agency and complete my oral board certification exams and my case list and all of that you have to do for OB. During that time back in the States, a couple things happened that kind of changed the trajectory of what the Lord had for me. One was that my father was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer and passed away during that time at home. And so that kind of extended my time at home a bit, dealing, with his illness and then with his loss. But so thankful that the Lord allowed me to be with him during that time. Mm-hmm. But also during that time, I received a call from my best friend, which I've told many people this story since and said everyone should have a friend like this in their lives, I think. But she had been activated to do more in the pro-life movement through her church during a 40 Days for Life event. So she called me up one day. She'd been watching a lot of things about abortion. She'd been listening. She had been listening to Scott Klusendorf and learning some good pro-life apologetics during that time. And so she called me one day and she said, Christina, you are a woman, you're an OBGYN, you're a Christian, and you say that you're pro-life, but I think that you should be doing more about it. Mm-hmm. And so, wow. She put me on the spot. And like I said, I think everybody should have a friend like that or someone like that in their life who's willing to challenge them with something like that. And so I said, well, you might be right. So let me think about this. And so she sent me some things to watch and listen to. And that really just began this journey for me of realizing that sometimes, the call that we have on our lives that we think we know exactly what that's going to look like, it might take a different turn than what we thought. But it's not really pulling us away from the main mission that the Lord has given us to do. And so I started really thinking about it again, researching a lot more into what does that look like for an OBGYN to be involved in the pro-life movement. And I won't bore you with all the details, but there was a lot of people that I talked to that I really trust. But really the turning point for me was I went to the National March for Life in Washington, D.C. And while I was there, I went to the Holocaust Museum, and I had never been there before. And I was going through the Holocaust Museum, and there's, for anybody who's listening, who's been there, you might remember there's a room at the museum that basically outlines the response, or really the lack thereof, of the U.S. during the Holocaust. And I remember sitting in that room and just thinking and becoming really very indignant and thinking, how could they know that these innocent people were being killed and not do anything about it? And if I was alive during that time, I would have done something about it. And the irony of that thought hit me in that moment. And I thought, you are living through a Holocaust of sorts, not to minimize the Jewish Holocaust.
60 million plus Holocaust, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're living through that right now, and you know that it's happening, and the Lord has positioned you in a rather unique position in the fact that I'm an OBGYN and I care about this issue. And so I really do need to have more of a voice, or, speak out more about this. So that's really what was kind of the turning point. Now, the Lord and I had a good struggle because I had told a lot of people that I was going to be overseas for the rest of my life, and that's what I was going to do. So there was a bit of a struggle, which I'm sure many of your listeners can identify with, but, just really prayed and realized that, yes, in fact, this was what the Lord was calling me to. So I went back to Kenya for a year to kind of tie up loose ends, and then came back in 2014 and have been working with APLOG ever since, and just know that this is what the Lord has called me to, and can't imagine not doing this. Because like you said, that we have 60 million victims, just the preborn victims, not to mention the families, the women, the fathers that have been affected by abortion.
Well, Christina, I have been a longstanding member of the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, but I'm sure that many of our listeners are not familiar with APLOG. So could you tell us a little bit about the work of APLOG, as well as the unique role that you feel it plays in the pro-life movement?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So APLOG is, we are a professional medical organization. So we're not a religious organization, but we do partner with a lot of religious medical organizations such as CMDA. But we are explicitly not religious so that we can be a second expert medical opinion to primarily ACOG, the American College of OBGYNs, on the issue of abortion. So APLOG exists to represent our members, our medical professional members who desire to practice medicine from a pro-life standpoint, to acknowledge that life is valuable and worth protecting from the moment of fertilization till the moment of natural death. And we specifically focus on the issue of abortion, educating our members so that they can have the evidence that they need to talk to their patients in the office or talk to their colleagues about the science behind the fact that life begins at fertilization, as well as the evidence that we have that abortion significantly harms women. So we're there primarily for our members. We also exist to help educate the public and also to help educate policymakers as they look at perhaps pro-life legislation or as we're going to talk about, I think, a little bit later, Supreme Court cases, things like that. So APLOG has been in existence since 1973, which is not a coincidence. That was the year that the Roe and Doe decisions were handed down. And we actually started as a special interest group within ACOG. As ACOG started to move in a more pro-abortion direction, and they actually submitted pro-abortion amicus briefs in the Roe and Doe cases, the large portion of their membership that were actually pro-life started to organize and formed this pro-life special interest group. We quickly became the largest special interest group within ACOG and remained that way until 2013 when they dissolved all special interest groups. And so then APLOG was birthed as its own organization. Since then, we have more than tripled our membership and are proud to represent our members in that way.
Well, Christina, I think both of us and maybe thousands of our members can identify with, maybe God will someday call me to be a missionary and serve overseas cross-culturally, and maybe they dream about that and have a vision of such a calling. But very few, including the two of us as we got started, had this vision, God is going to use me in the public square in advocacy. And I would guess that most of our listeners probably are in that category, maybe feeling that partisan politics and so forth, activism is an anathema. Tell our listeners why you think our listeners, our physicians, our members, and other constituents need to get involved in the public square, especially on issues like abortion.
That is a great question. And Mike, I'm with you and Jeff in that never in a million years would I have thought that this is the position that I would be in. And if you would have asked me a few years ago, I would have told you I had no interest in it. So, God does change our paths for sure. But you're right. This is very important. I think abortion, unfortunately, is seen oftentimes as a political issue, but it really isn't. Abortion is a moral and actually a medical issue that has been politicized. And so, we need to kind of take back that narrative in some way and say, as physicians, one, we know that as physicians who care for pregnant women, that we're taking care of two patients. From the moment she becomes pregnant, there's another patient living inside of her. And our duty as physicians is to, in as much as we can and as much as is in our power, to protect and promote the health and the lives of our patients. And that includes our preborn patients. And so we need to be advocates for our patients and defending them against the really assault that exists right now in this country and around the world. So that's one thing, is that it's part of our duty as physicians to advocate for our patients. And so while we might not see ourselves as political advocates, we are patient advocates, and we should be advocating for them. And so that's part of what we need to do. The other thing, though, is that, we live in a political reality in that we have to live by, the laws of our land, and we have to be involved in helping craft those and helping our policymakers to know where it is that we stand as a country. And I will tell you that as I've gotten more and more involved in this world, what I've noticed is that the pro-abortion side will always have physicians show up. Even though those physicians represent actually the minority of physicians, we know that more than 90% of OBGYNs in this country don't perform abortions. So those physicians that show up to advocate for no abortion restrictions and abortion on demand up until birth, they will always show up for the pro-abortion side, but we have a really hard time getting physicians to show up on the pro-life side. And I understand why that is. I understand that people oftentimes feel scared to be vocal about it because of, pushback that they might face within their job situation or from their colleagues. But it is so important that we show up. And I can't overemphasize that you don't need really any additional expertise than your medical expertise that you already have. All you need to do is show up with the training that you already have, and it will make such a huge impact. If I can, I'll just share one quick story that I think shows the impact of this. So we at APLOG, and this is another, request to any physicians who are listening to join CMDA and APLOG as we prepare people to be expert witnesses on a state level. This past year, there were about 500 pro-life bills that were introduced in states across the country, which is amazing. But that meant that APLOG, and I'm sure CMDA did as well, we were getting 2 or 3 requests a week, probably from different states, asking for physicians to come and testify in support of these pieces of pro-life legislation. And so we got a request from the state of New Hampshire, and one nice side effect, I suppose, of the COVID pandemic and everybody using Zoom is that now a lot of times you can testify virtually for these states. So I was able to testify virtually in the state of New Hampshire. They were contemplating a ban on abortions after 24 weeks, which seems so unbelievable to me that this even has to be debated. These are babies that are viable outside of their mother's wombs. And there was a debate over whether or not we should start banning abortions in the state of New Hampshire after 24 weeks. So I gladly signed up to testify about, the humanity of these children, about the risk of abortion to women after 24 weeks. And we had 2 or 3 other APLOG members join me and testify as well. Thankfully, that bill passed in the state of New Hampshire, and the person who had contacted me from the state, one of the pro-life lobbyists there, emailed me afterwards, and he said, I can't tell you how much of an impact it made that you all showed up to testify. This was the first time in 12 years we have had a pro-life physician show up to testify.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, so amazing to me. And I thought, I don't think it passed because of something, outstanding that I or someone else said. We simply spoke the truth and spoke out of our medical expertise, but it was just the fact that we showed up. And so I would just encourage anyone who's listening to this. It really is not difficult to do this. Like I said, all you need is the medical expertise that you already have. And CMDA and APLOG in our partnership together can provide you with the data points that you need for, a specific bill. But it really just takes showing up, because you are a physician, you're a medical expert. And if all they hear from is a medical expert on the side of ACOG or on the side of Planned Parenthood, they're going to assume that that's what all physicians, all medical professionals think. And so they need to hear from the other perspective. And we really do have truth and science on our side.
Well, Christina, I am so thrilled to hear your answer with that. And I can add to it in that our work within the American Academy of Medical Ethics, we have also been asked to supply people that will provide witness on testimony in various pro-life laws. And unfortunately, we had a couple of states that wanted residents within their state, and we couldn't find anybody. And that was a huge disappointment and, of course, a missed opportunity. But I'm so thankful that you have made the point. It's easy to do this. You just need to be a licensed healthcare professional, and you can make a huge difference. So with that in mind, Mike has briefly mentioned the Dobbs case that's coming up on December 1st. And I'm sure that many of our members are not necessarily very familiar with the specifics of that case. So could you briefly summarize the law and maybe give a little bit about how it got to the Supreme Court on December 1st?
Yes. So what people are hearing referred to as the Dobbs case is a case out of Mississippi. So the state of Mississippi passed a law called the Gestational Age Act, and it was passed in 2018, really with bipartisan support. And what this law did is it restricted abortions within the state of Mississippi to 15 weeks gestation or less, with the only exceptions being a life of the mother exception and an exception for severe fetal anomalies. Again, this was passed with bipartisan support. After it was passed and signed into law by the governor, the lone abortion facility remaining in the state of Mississippi, the Jackson Abortion Facility, sued the state over this law. And of course, as happens in most cases where states pass any sort of abortion restriction, an injunction was placed against the law, claiming that it was unconstitutional because of Roe and Casey. And so then that was appealed then to a higher court, and actually both of the higher courts, so the district court and the appellate court, upheld the injunction. And so the state of Mississippi then appealed it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court earlier this year agreed to hear oral arguments on this case. And so the case has become known as Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. And so the court will hear oral arguments on December 1st. In this case. And the reason the reason the pro-life movement is so excited about this case and why it's so important is because really the 15-week mark is somewhat of an arbitrary mark in the fact that what this case is doing is it's challenging the viability threshold and cutoff that Roe put into place and then Planned Parenthood v. Casey confirmed. And so basically what that is, for anyone who's not familiar with that precedent, is that basically what that says is prior to viability, states really can't restrict abortions at all. After viability, they can put certain restrictions in place and those can stand. But prior to viability, states really can't restrict abortion. And of course, any of us who practice medicine, especially who do obstetrics, know that this quote unquote viability line is really an arbitrary standard that was put into place by legal folks, not by physicians. And it has changed significantly in the 50 years since Roe was handed down. So at the time of Roe, viability was really at about 28 weeks, even later in some places. Now we have viability down to 22, even 21 weeks in some places. I think the youngest baby who was born and survived was born at 21 weeks and 2 days and just celebrated his first birthday. So, we continue to move that viability line earlier and earlier. And not only is it moving earlier and earlier, but it's different depending on what hospital you're in. It's different depending on what country you're in. So it really is a ridiculous line to say that we are going to protect life after this line, but we're not going to protect life prior to it. And so this case has probably the best chance of any case since Roe of at least weakening the Roe decision and allowing states to put in some pre-viability restrictions. But the state of Mississippi has actually very boldly, and I think correctly, asked the court to consider overturning Roe and Casey completely and allow this law in Mississippi to stand, which of course wouldn't just impact women and children in the state of Mississippi, but women and children all over this country. So,
well, Christine, we hear all of the time from those who are pro-abortion that women's reproductive health and abortion is health care. And recently, you were part of drafting a statement that represents a number of our organizations working together. And I fondly remember a statement that our CEO Emeritus, David Stevens, would say in my presence so many times, Mike, either we hang together or we're going to hang separately. And so a very exciting thing that's happening in collaboration between APLOG and CMDA and the Catholic Medical Association and the Coptic Medical Association. Many of our listeners probably didn't know that existed, but yes, there are 4,000 to 5,000 Egyptian Orthodox Christians who are also fighting abortion. And instead of fighting separately, we're fighting together. And you drafted a statement recently, I believe in response to the Texas heartbeat bill recently that's also been in the news big time for our listeners, that abortion is not health care. So would you talk to us about the risks and the health problems that abortion poses for women?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I think so often we just hear this assumption and this statement that abortion is essential women's healthcare, but they never back that up with any evidence. And so part of the purpose of that statement was to briefly put out there the evidence that we have that abortion is actually extremely harmful for women. And of course, it ends the life of our preborn patients as well. We like to say pregnancy is not a disease. It doesn't need treated. And abortion actually doesn't treat any sort of disease process or improve outcomes. So some of the very well-proven health detriments to women that we know of are a significantly increased risk of preterm birth in future pregnancies. This has been proven by more than 160 studies. And actually, the Institute of Medicine acknowledged it as an immutable risk factor for preterm birth. So, we hear all the time, we screen our patients for, do you have a history of cervical procedures? Do you have a history? Do you smoke? All of these things that impact their risk of preterm birth and try to modify those to reduce their risk. But once a woman has a surgical abortion, she cannot reduce the risk that poses to her for preterm birth and future pregnancies. And the really devastating thing about that is it causes very premature births. So premature births less than 32 weeks, where we know that those babies not only have an increased risk of mortality, but a significantly increased risk of morbidity, from the complications of prematurity. So this is a huge issue in this country as we face a preterm birth crisis that we haven't been able to really make a dent in. And I personally believe that one of the reasons we haven't made a dent in it is because no one's addressing this issue of abortions leading to preterm birth. And just one more point on that subject, we see the rise of chemical abortions in this country. They now represent the majority of abortions in this country. And the group of women that has the highest risk of preterm birth and future pregnancies are women that begin an abortion with medications, with Mifeprex, and then have to have them surgically completed, which we know that in the first trimester, that happens to about 8% of women. Those women have a 300% increased risk of preterm birth and future pregnancies. Mm-hmm. So as we see this incidence of chemical abortion rise, we're going to see our incidence of preterm birth rise as well, because of that complication. And women aren't being told this when they go to abortion facilities. They're not being told of this increased risk. We also see an increased risk of breast cancer in women that have abortions prior to their first full-term birth. And again, this is proven by dozens of studies, statistically significant studies. And we also see an increased risk of mental health disorders, an increased risk of depression and suicide, anxiety, substance abuse. There's a study out of Finland, which does a very good job collecting this data because of centralized medical records, that showed that women who have had abortions in their past are 7 times more likely to commit suicide than women who haven't. And, we continue to see this just explosion of mental health disorders in this country, not just related to abortion, but, related to many other things. And abortion is contributing to that. And so, the statement that we put out from our organizations was to make a firm statement from approximately 30,000 physicians that abortion is not healthcare. It does not improve outcomes. It worsens them. And as such, should not be treated as essential healthcare because it couldn't be further from the truth.
Well, Christina, I know that there's been a hot topic in terms of chemical abortion, and this has been one thing that has been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, in that prior to the pandemic, it was impossible or was illegal for any healthcare professional to prescribe the chemicals for chemical abortion. But since the pandemic, they have been allowed to do so via telemedicine. And I know that there are many active in the pro-abortion forces that are trying to make that legal again. So could you take a few minutes and speak to that issue?
Yes, absolutely. This is a very important issue, and it really is kind of the next frontier for the abortion industry. So, as you said, Jeff, prior to the COVID pandemic, there were restrictions in place from the FDA called the REMS, or the Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy, that governed the use of Mifeprex. Mifeprex is one of only 50 medications that are approved by the FDA that have these REMS in place, and they are reserved for medications that have significant adverse side effects associated with them in order to try to minimize the harm to patients and maximize the quote unquote benefit to patients. Of course, we would hold that this medication carries no benefit to our patients. But these REMS basically, in brief, required that a woman be seen in person to receive these medications, that she have her gestational age confirmed and the location of the pregnancy confirmed to ensure that she doesn't have an ectopic pregnancy, and that she be apprised of the risks associated with Mifeprex, which has very significant risks associated with it. We know that at least 24 women in the US alone have died related to these medications. So these REMS were in place prior to COVID. However, once the COVID pandemic hit, ACOG, the American College of OBGYNs, actually sued the FDA over these REMS, stating that they were too onerous and they imposed too much of an undue burden on women to be able to obtain medication abortions during the pandemic. Unfortunately, a federal judge in the state of Maryland upheld or placed an injunction on the REMS based on that lawsuit. And that has remained in place because of the pandemic, and the FDA is currently reviewing those REMS. The dangers of these REMS being lifted, one is that then these medications theoretically could go over the counter so that anyone could access them. But two, the main dangers are of women not being seen in person and having an ultrasound to confirm their gestational age and the location of their pregnancy. I think anyone listening who takes care of pregnant women will understand the dangers of this. So we know that the risk of hemorrhage, incomplete abortion, and retained tissue increase significantly after 8 to 10 weeks, which is what these medications are currently approved for, up to 10 weeks. So if a woman takes these in the second trimester, she has a 40% risk of needing emergency surgery to complete her abortion and a significant risk of hemorrhage. Also, if she has an ectopic pregnancy, ACOG currently says that you can screen for ectopic pregnancy in the case of medication abortions just based on risk factors and symptoms. And that's it. If she has no risk factors, no symptoms, you can assume she doesn't have an ectopic pregnancy, which all of us knows amounts to medical malpractice. So women are going to maybe have an ectopic pregnancy, it ruptures, they have some abdominal pain and vaginal bleeding. Problem is the symptoms of a medication abortion, abdominal pain and vaginal bleeding, and they're going to be told this is normal. So they're going to wait it out at home, and we are going to see women die from this. So this is a legitimate concern for women's health. It does not represent good medicine whatsoever. There's already 70 websites up on the internet where women can obtain these dangerous medications without having any sort of in-person visit or medical oversight. And so APLOG actually just in the last week put out a committee opinion on the dangers of telemed or no visit abortions. And people who are listening can find that resource at our website, aaplog.org, under the resources tab. And I would encourage you to look at it, because I can guarantee you, you will be seeing patients in your office. If you take care of reproductive age women, or if you're an emergency room physician, you will be seeing patients who are suffering the complications of this. So it's very important that we understand these complications and that we as medical professionals take a stand to say that we will not stand for this mistreatment of our patients.
Christina and Jeff, as I was doing Google search over the last few days in preparation for this interview, I was amazed. I could not find a pro-life result in the first 10 or 15 results. Everything, it's very top-loaded with pro-abortion references, everything related to the Dobbs case. And a number of advertisements, a number of people have paid for advertisements, so they're first as well.
People on both sides of this issue see this case for the significance that it has, that we could potentially see Roe finally fall after 50 years. So it is a big deal. It's going to be a historic day for sure.
Well, Christina, moving to a little bit more of a practical level, and I practiced OBGYN for many years here in rural Ohio. But I'm curious as to what kind of lessons you've learned with your passion for fighting abortion as an OBGYN. How do you personally talk to your pregnant abortion-minded patients? What is the number one risk? I think you may have alluded to it with preterm labor, but what are the things that you mention to them as you're counseling them?
That's a great question, Jeff, because I think that is a clinical scenario that is very intimidating and overwhelming to a lot of physicians, even pro-life physicians who really desire to steer their patients away from the harms of abortion, but feel very ill-equipped, I think, sometimes to do so. And so when I was still seeing patients in the office, I would occasionally have women come in to me to say, I'm thinking about having an abortion. Are you willing to talk to me about that? One thing that I found is that for women who know for sure that they want to have an abortion, most times they don't come and see their physician. They know where they need to go. They know they need to go to Planned Parenthood or some other abortion facility. And so they just go there. I really think that most women who come to their physician's office to discuss abortion, it's because somewhere maybe deep inside of them, they're questioning that decision and they just need somebody to talk to about it. And so what I found worked the best was when someone came to my office and said that she was thinking about abortion, the first thing I would say to her is, can you tell me why you think that's the best decision for you? Because oftentimes what would come out in that was she would say, well, I just don't feel like I have the support that I need to raise this child. Or, well, my boyfriend is really pressuring me and I just don't feel like I have any other option. Or my parents are really pressuring me. So I found just asking that one very open-ended question would reveal a lot about where she was in her life and why she thought that that was the right decision for her. And so if it's just a lack of support, we had all kinds of supports we could offer her. I would encourage any physician who is seeing pregnant patients to, make sure you have in your office at your fingertips whatever local resources you can provide to that woman who's facing an unexpected pregnancy. Or if I found out that she was being pressured to have an abortion, then of course that opened a door to talk about how coercion is never okay. You could screen for, intimate partner violence and all of that. So that opened up that door. And then from there, if she still sounded like she was contemplating abortion, then I would go into, first of all, do you know what this is that's growing inside of you? Do you know that this is a fully fledged, distinct, living and whole human being that's growing inside of you? This is your child. And we would talk about the risks that are involved with abortions. And does she understand that those are the risks that are there? And I tell you, I wish I would have kept track of hard numbers, but I bet 8 or 9 times out of 10, just having that conversation and not even me saying, you can't choose abortion. She has the option to choose what she wants to choose, but just talking through those things, 8 or 9 times out of 10, she left my office and decided to continue her pregnancy.
Praise God.
Praise the Lord. You're right. But sometimes I hesitate to say that because I don't want to make it sound like I have amazing powers of persuasion. I really don't. It just was because I think that in so many situations, those women just need somebody to say, let's put on the brakes for a second. Let's talk through this. I know that you are in a crisis situation right now where you can't see through the fog that is surrounding your brain because all you can see is, oh my gosh, I'm pregnant. How on earth am I going to handle this? But let's just put the brakes on. Let's talk through it. And I want you to take some time to think. And I think so many women just need somebody to do that versus if they come into their physician's office and their physician says, oh, you want an abortion? Okay, here's the number for Planned Parenthood. First of all, that takes way less time than having the discussion that I would typically have with my patients. So, but second of all, I think then they're just going to say, okay, well, my doctor must think that it's a good idea, so I'm going to go through with it. So I think a lot of women just need someone to listen to them, and they just need somebody to say, you need to hear the risks. I know you're not going to hear this at Planned Parenthood, so you need to hear from somebody the truth behind abortion. And, really and truly, I think probably most people who are listening to this podcast are pro-life, but regardless of where a physician or another medical professional stands on the issue of abortion, we all should agree that women deserve fully informed consent. They deserve to know the risks that they are going to be undertaking if they go through an abortion. They deserve to know the fact that that is a living human being growing inside of them. And then at least if they make an abortion decision, they've made it fully informed. But I think one of the things that grieves my heart the most, on top of the fact that preborn children are having their lives brutally ended through abortion, is that women have completely had the fleece pulled over their eyes, and they have been lied to for decades by the abortion industry, saying that this is essential healthcare, that it's safe, that it's no different than having a tooth pulled or taking Tylenol. These are lies that are being told to women. And one of the things that APLOG really is striving to do is to help women be informed and to receive the excellent medical care that they so deeply deserve.
Well, Christina, I want our listeners to know and that we at CMDA are so grateful for your leadership as well as the leadership of Dr. Donna Harrison, your executive director of APLOG, because for the last 2 or 3 years, you've both envisioned. I was there in January of 2018 in Washington, D.C., as we sat around a table with some of those folks I mentioned earlier and what has now become the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. And we share with you a great concern that in the future it may be rare for a pro-life OBGYN like yourself to be in an exam room with a woman and to give her fully inform her of risks and benefits and the choices that she has, and to have that sort of 80% outcome. So I want to encourage you. Thank you for your leadership of this Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. And I wanted to ask you to share with our listeners how, if they choose to get involved and they're available for the Dobbs case, how can they sign up and show up in their white coats and be a part of representing pro-life physicians and other healthcare professionals across the country?
Yes, thank you. I would love to have as many people join us that day as possible. So we, as an alliance and as a medical coalition of organizations, have organized for a group of physicians and other medical professionals to be in front of the Supreme Court on the day of oral arguments, which again is December 1st, that morning, to make a visual statement. So we want physicians in their white coats, or if nurses, or we have a couple ultrasonographers that are coming, we want you to wear your medical gear. So we make a visual statement that as medical professionals, we support overturning Roe v. Wade and respecting the life of all of our patients, our preborn and our born patients. And so we currently have just over 60 that are committed to coming, which I'm super excited about. We'd love to have more. And so if someone is interested, they can either contact you all at CMDA, or they're welcome to contact me directly. And my email address is Christina, that's with a CH, at aaplog.org. And you're welcome to email me if you're interested in joining us that day. And then further details will be sent out. It'll be a rally that will be taking place in front of the Supreme Court for most of the morning on December 1st. And again, we would love to have you there with us in person if you're able to be there, just to make that very, I think, strong visual statement that abortion is not healthcare, and that there are a lot of medical professionals who would support abortion not being legal in this country anymore.
Well, thank you, Dr. Francis. I know that a number of Christians and a number of our listeners are maybe a little adverse to the concept that we're in a war and that we're warriors, but I want to close with a scripture that Paul gave to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And he starts off by saying, by the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you, Corinthians. And I think that's important, humility and gentleness of Christ. And then he says, I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war. I think some people would have appreciated if Paul would have just stopped there. We don't wage war, but he doesn't stop there. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. And I think abortion has been a stronghold in this country for too many decades. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge and may I add image of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient unto Christ. So, Christina, we at CMDA are going to be hosting and challenge our members to join us in a day of prayer and fasting for December 1st, because I think those are the weapons that Paul is talking about, that we have divine power to demolish strongholds, and God will be our advocate and our warrior on that day against this hideous crime, the Holocaust of abortion in America today. Thanks for joining us today on CMDA Matters, and God bless you. And Dr. Barrows and I will look forward to standing with you on those steps of the Supreme Court come December 1st, God willing.
Amen. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, just like Dr. Francis said, as Christians in healthcare, we know that abortion does not equal healthcare. In the nearly 50 years since the court wrongly decided Roe v. Wade, medical science, as you heard, has progressed significantly and has increasingly supported the pro-life position we hold. It is finally time that the law of our land catches up with the advances in medical science and supports the human rights of all of our patients, including the preborn. And more than ever, this case has the opportunity to speak to the value as well as the intrinsic worth of human life, created in the image of God. CMDA's leadership, we've been praying for this case for many months now, and it continues to weigh heavily on our hearts. That's why we feel led by the Lord to join together as the body of Christ, and we have set aside Wednesday, December 1st, as a special day of prayer as well as fasting. I hope that you will join me in spending time petitioning God to move mightily and, yes, miraculously, to protect the unborn. We desperately need God to open the eyes of our lawmakers to see the terrible injustice of abortion. We are praying for God to move the hearts of each court justice and give them courage to stand against this assault on God's children. Well, you can visit cmda.org/Dobbs, D-O-B-B-S, for more information and to download a prayer guide that we've prepared just for you to help direct your prayer time on that day. So please join us Wednesday, December 1st for a day of prayer and fasting by our CMDA members and others. And just one more thing. On December 1st, both Dr. Jeff Barrows and I will be wearing our white coats and standing on the steps of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., with other like-minded healthcare professionals as we speak out for you and the sanctity of preborn human life. I want to invite you, if you can, to join us as we seek to make our voices heard on this important issue in our country. As Christians in healthcare, we recognize abortion for what it really is, the intentional destruction of human life through barbaric methods. It is time for us, friends, to boldly defend the lives of all of our patients and demand that our preborn patients be protected and that our pregnant patients be empowered instead of lied to consistently. Women and their children, they deserve our support, not the destruction of abortion. If you are interested in joining us on the steps of the Supreme Court in D.C. on December 1st, all you need to do is reach out to CMDA's Advocacy and Communications Department using the email address communications@cmda.org, and we will give you the details on how you can be a part on that day. Well, given the subject of our podcast today and our guest, we thought it was perfect timing for us to introduce to you the newest member of our CMDA senior staff, our new Director of Federal Public Policy, Anna Pilato, who has been in Washington, D.C. environs for many years now, most recently working at Health and Human Services. And so just for a few minutes, I wanted you to hear from her about her perspective, her new perspective on CMDA and our federal public policy efforts. Well, I'm so happy today to introduce to all of you, our listeners, our new Director of Federal Public Policy, Anna Pilato, who has been living in Washington, D.C. for a number of years. So welcome today to CMDA Matters, Anna.
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate you having me on today.
Well, I wish our listeners could see the long list of positions that you've held at both the state level, I believe in the state of Kansas, as well as in Washington, D.C. And so for all the positions that you've held over the years, what was the state or federal job responsibility that brought you the greatest satisfaction?
What comes to mind is my most recent position at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The agency I worked under was the Administration for Children and Families, and of course, lots of acronyms. So ACF serves folks who are often facing trauma or are facing crisis. So to kind of jump into it, really the most satisfying part was my ability to work with faith-based groups. And I also worked with state and federal officials in various capacities, but really my heartbeat was working with faith-based groups because those groups are the ones actually doing the direct work. They're providing direct services to those in need. So my ability to be able to highlight that good work across the country and then build relationships and then be able to build networks from those relationships, which in essence would make the work stronger and more effective. So I was gratefully in a situation where we had the ability to encourage this. So that absolutely was my most satisfying work.
So Anna, in those years in working on the human side of health and human services, how common was it for you to find someone with an ardent faith in Christ and you could detect that their Lord Jesus was important to them?
That's a really interesting question. And from my perspective of having worked under two administrations, which both happened to be at HHS, there were probably more believers than one might think. In those administrations that I worked under, there was a willingness to partner with people of faith and faith-based groups. And I believe once staff, maybe line staff, saw this willingness demonstrated, this helped create a more openness. They felt freer to express their faith. But to answer your question, it's not unusual to come across people of faith, but government employees do tend to be more cautious about expressing faith. But I think once they see people in leadership expressing faith, they opened up. One thing I would encourage people of faith to consider working for the federal government to influence policy. Those line middle staff really have a lot of sway and power. And it's very important if we really are serious about transforming policy that people across the country, including our members, that they would go and work for their state and local and federal government. It's very important. And one more thing, I think it's really important to pray for people of faith who are currently working in the federal government. Many of them are trying to live out their faith, but perhaps some of the current policies being made, they might have some conflict with. So it's important not to forget those ones, those kind of hidden ones in the various agencies.
How do you see CMDA, with the support and engagement of our membership, having the greatest impact on healthcare policy at the federal level?
Well, I think CMDA members and our organization have a tremendous opportunity to impact policy, frankly, at all levels of government. I think it's an exciting time to highlight the conservative viewpoint. We have a wealth of expertise across membership to help move the needle in a quote unquote righteous direction. Obviously, the medical field has been elevated in the media and it's in everyday conversation as never before. If we can harness that expertise that's represented across the country, it will be extremely impactful and really can help transform policy as never before. And one thing I would say is, as far as impact on federal policy, I'd encourage our members to reach out to their members of Congress, even in their home districts, as well as to reach out to state and local reps on issues that are concerning to us and to them. Build a relationship with your lawmakers. Go make yourself the go-to expert on issues that are important to you, that concern you. Get involved in the political process. These are things that maybe seem difficult or out of reach, but honestly, it's as easy as a phone call to your local representative. And one little secret, Often these policymakers are not experts, especially in issues such as medical interventions. They don't know, they're not the experts. So they want folks that they can rely on. So if our members can make themselves indispensable to these members, I would guarantee you in some form or way, policy will be transformed.
Well, Anna, thank you for challenging our members that way. We need to hear that frequently. God bless you this week, Anna, and thanks for taking a few minutes out of your time today to talk with our listeners.
Thanks, Mike, and Lord bless you. Appreciate the time.
Well, as I bring us down the home stretch, I want you to know that next week's podcast, I will have as my co-host Pastor Bert Jones, our Director of Leadership and Church Relations, and he will join me in a timely conversation with our guest, Dr. Matthew Sleeth, on his 2021 book entitled Hope Always: How to Be a Force for Life in a Culture of Suicide. At a time many are calling the age of American despair, his book and his insight are priceless. You don't want to miss it. If you'd like to suggest a future guest for our podcast, you can just email us, and someone did that this week, at CMDA Matters at cmda.org. And if you like our podcast, be sure to give us a 5-star rating and share us on your favorite social media platform today. You know, the beloved Apostle John told us that we are confident that God hears us whenever we ask for anything that pleases Him. And we at CMDA have confidence that God has been hearing our prayers on this issue of abortion in our country, and that our Father will continue to listen as we turn to Him in prayer, that weapon that we fight with. Thank you in advance for joining with us on Wednesday, December 1st, in praying for His will to be done to halt the abortion holocaust in America today. And thank you for joining with us in standing up to protect the lives of God's children that He is, as David said, knitting together in the wombs of their mothers. In late 2020, we heard from over 1,400 of our members surveyed that protecting preborn life matters supremely to our members. I hope you heard it loud and clear today in our conversation with Dr. Christina Francis that it certainly matters to CMDA and CMDA Matters. We'll see you next week, God willing.
This podcast has been a production of the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. The opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are not necessarily endorsed by the Christian Medical and Dental Associations. CMDA is a nonpartisan organization that does not endorse political parties or candidates for public office. The views expressed on this podcast reflect judgments regarding principles and values held by CMDA and its members and are not intended to imply endorsement of any political party or candidate.